It's nice to have you on my podcast today.
Good evening, Vladimir.
And in the beginning, I was really confused how to properly introduce you, because you have this political part of you when you've been a member of the Conservative Party, then over time switched to Liberal Democrats. And on the other hand, you also have your side where you're managing Muslim and Jewish relationships. How would you describe yourself?
Well, I've had so many different interests and activities in my life. I've never been a person who just did one thing. And I retired from being a tax partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers 15 years ago. And I never wanted to retire to watch more television. So I'm involved in so many different things that I'm interested in. I'm interested in politics. I care about interfaith relations and the role of religion in society. I'm an expert on Islamic finance, especially the taxation of Islamic finance, so I still write regularly about that. I speak to schools to encourage children to make their lives better. So I just have lots of different interests. I also play lots of chess.
Oh, that's quite fortunate. I've been playing chess for like 14 years now.
Right.
And professionally. And I think chess players have a certain level of... certainly they think differently and they conduct themselves differently. And I think to balance out, as you do, balance between faiths, it's very, very important to choose words correctly. And one of the most almost sensitive topics right now that can never be discussed is the war between Israel and Palestine.
That's right.
What's your stance on that?
Well, first of all, going back to what you said about the importance of words, that's something I've been very conscious all my life and more attuned to it and more aware of it as I've got older, because the precise words that you use make such a difference, because, of course, we communicate with words and we react to words with very emotional reactions sometimes. Now, you asked me about Israel and Palestine. I've been following the Israel-Palestine conflict since I was about 12 years old, because even as a child, I was a news junkie. And in my early teenage years, I used to get my father to buy a copy of the Sunday Times newspaper and a copy of the Observer newspaper for me every Sunday, and almost the whole of Sunday would be spent with me lying in bed with the newspaper on the floor, because newspapers are very bulky, reading the newspaper more or less from cover to cover.
At 12 years old?
Yes.
This is crazy.
So, and the reason I remember this is that at those times, there were regularly terrorist attacks into Israel by Palestinian guerrillas from Lebanon or from Syria or from Jordan. And they used to call themselves Fedayeen, which means something like freedom fighters or guerrilla fighters. It's a phrase you never hear anymore now. So I've been following the conflict ever since. I was 16 years old at the time of the Six-Day War. And so I remember very clearly myself the build-up to the war and then the war itself happening, how shocking it was. I remember the Yom Kippur War. So I've lived through the conflict. And I'll be quite honest, as a young teenager, you, especially if you are from a Muslim background, without knowing very much, or without knowing anything about the situation other than what I read in the newspapers, which is just the latest sort of incident, I grew up with a natural sympathy for my fellow Muslims, the Palestinian Arabs. Although, of course, many of the Palestinians are not Arabs, they're also Christians in a significant minority. The older I've got over the last 60 years, and the more I've learned about it, the more my sympathies are much more balanced. You're never exactly 50-50 about anything, but I'm much more sympathetic to the Jewish perspective on the conflict now than I was when I was 12 years old, for example, much more sympathetic. And I have written about the Israel-Palestinian conflict on my website. I've given 3 presentations on the conflict The first one was given to a school in London, the Francis Holland School, which is a girls' school. I gave a talk to their sixth form politics society for about 20 minutes. And the point I emphasized in that talk, because you're talking to school children, you're not trying to indoctrinate them, you're not trying to get them to support one side or the other. I emphasized that people behave with the conflict the way that they behave with football. They pick a side, whether they pick the Palestinian side or the Israeli side, then afterwards, everything that their side does is correct, and everything that the other side does is wrong, and that's all they want. That's the only way they think about it. And I emphasized to these sixth form girls that they had a responsibility to learn about the history, to understand that there are wrongs on both sides and rights on both sides.
And it's very important to explore those different points of views. And but tell me more about how do you come to conclusions in regards to this war? Because many people are debating whether the proportion of the Israel's response to the attack on October 7th. And on the other side, of course, many people are debating how Israel has been behaving towards Palestine over the years. And of course, balancing out with the fact that in Palestine there is no clear, there is in a way like a power vacuum. And everybody who, all the organizations who are basically supporting and helping Palestinians to live are now described as terrorist organizations. So it is a very hard situation there. But what do you make of it?
Well, as you say, it's a very hard situation. It's a very complicated situation. And the thing to remember is that people's behaviors and actions are always heavily influenced, not totally determined, but very heavily influenced by the way that the other party has behaved towards them. Mm-hmm. And we don't have time to start from 1917 or 1900 onwards, but if we just start from the 7th of October, 2023, as a starting point, because it keeps the discussion shorter, Hamas's assault on Israel and the massacre of Israeli civilians was absolutely monstrous. As Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, said, it didn't come out of a clear blue sky. History didn't start on that day, but let's just start from there. So that was a monstrous attack. Israel had the choice of how to respond. At the level of human nature, and also when you look at Benjamin Netanyahu's internal legal problems in Israel, his political problems vis-a-vis his coalition, I can understand, and the word understand in English is often misunderstood because it means two different things. I understand you can mean I sympathize. I understand can mean I comprehend. And those are two totally different meanings of the word. I'm using it in the sense of comprehend. I can comprehend why Israel has responded the way that it did. But what Israel has ended up doing is fighting what I would describe as a war of revenge. Israel is trying to destroy Hamas, but frankly, if you look at its behavior, it almost doesn't care how many innocent Palestinians get killed along the way. And that, of course, has in turn resulted in a worldwide reaction of increased hostility to Israel. Was it the best strategy for Israel to follow? In my view, no. And if you want, we can spend more time talking about what was the correct strategy. But I'm a critic of Hamas. I'm a critic of Benjamin Netanyahu and the behavior of the Israeli government. You can criticize both.
Well, let me switch a little bit from this particular war to how the world has responded to this war. As many countries, powerful countries like the US, like the UK, are publicly supporting Israel because it's a trading partner. because it benefits them to support Israel. Many of the simpler people who are not in the government have stood up in support of Palestine. And those hostilities that have been created on both sides towards Jewish people who are not necessarily involved with the war, just living in other countries, and towards Muslim people who are once again not involved but living in the UK, for example, they are very much seen in the society right now. How would you explain to a normal person that the war and the actions of Israeli government has nothing to do with, does not necessarily have to result in hatred towards a certain nation or nationality?
Again, it's really important to remember that individuals who live outside Israel, whether they're Jewish or whether they are Muslim, they are not, or whether even if they are Palestinian origin, they are not responsible for the conduct of either Hamas or the conduct of the Israeli government. And furthermore, a Jewish person, for example, living in this country is perfectly entitled to be supportive of the existence of the State of Israel. I'm supportive of the existence of the State of Israel. I do not want to see Israel destroyed. I think that would be catastrophic. I know a great deal about the history of the Holocaust. I've been to Auschwitz. I think it's actually highly desirable to have a state which has a Jewish majority population, but provided it's a state that provides full civil rights for all of its citizens. So the key thing is people need to remember that when they talk about the conflict, they should talk about the conflict in measured language, not using language that demonizes the party that they disagree with. And they need to remember that their fellow citizens are not the people that they are talking about. They're talking about a foreign country and the behavior of foreign parties.
And that's what people often forget, especially as they tend to see Western governments now as those who are supporting. For example, in the case of people who support Palestine in the conflict, they tend to see Western governments as those supporting violence and supporting misuse of power towards people in Palestine. And we could see that hatred towards West in a way in Islamic countries, starting from Iraq, starting from other invasions. How significant do you think those events were? And do you think those events started this whole, almost like we can see now that there is almost a gap of understanding the geopolitics between Islamic countries and Western countries?
Well, the geopolitical gap that you're talking about between Muslim majority countries, because I don't use the phrase Islamic countries because what makes a country Islamic? But there are countries clearly where Muslims are a majority of the population, and there are countries where Muslims are a minority of the population. I'm also, if you look on the 800 pages of my website, you see I almost never use the phrase like the West, because what does it mean? Because nobody can agree which countries, for example, are in the West. And you get totally variable definitions. For example, I read Huntington's book, The Clash of Civilizations, and he draws all kinds of distinctions between the Latin American civilization and European North American civilization. Is Australia, most people would classify in the West, except that it's part in the Southeast. The question of it is, are Japan and South Korea in the West or are they not in the West? I avoid phrases like that because they reduce understanding rather than helping understanding. So I prefer to think about individual countries, and even for countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, there are very significant differences between the positions that those countries have taken on the conflict. The extent of their military support for Israel is varied. Certainly the question of what would happen if Benjamin Netanyahu set foot in those countries is extremely different, because he can visit the United States of America. If he set foot in the UK, he would be arrested because we are a party to the International Criminal Court. So it's, in my view, incorrect to just have a broad brush generalization. And the position that individual countries take towards the conflict is conditioned both by their internal politics. So, for example, the United States, Christian Zionism is a really important political factor, as well as, obviously, the United States has a significant Jewish community, but there's also much more powerful in terms of numbers are Christian Zionists. And similarly, Germany's policy on Israel and Palestine is heavily conditioned by the memory of the Holocaust and the historical guilt that Germany still feels. So I think it's wrong to generalize about Western countries.
Okay, so then let me rephrase my question. As you wouldn't like to use the term Islamic countries, how do you think the 2003 invasion in Iraq, for example, by the US,
yes,
has formed the sort of hatred towards the US from Muslim majority countries?
Yes, I would say quite clearly that the image of the United States of America was severely damaged in many, but not necessarily all, Muslim majority countries by the invasion of Iraq by the United States and Britain, for example. But even there, it's never universal. If you think of Kuwaitis, Kuwait had the experience of being invaded by Iraq in 1990 and being liberated in the first Gulf War. I haven't looked at any public opinion polls of Kuwaitis' attitudes towards the United States after 2003, but I wouldn't expect the same reaction in Kuwait as, for example, in Pakistan. So these things vary, but undoubtedly the Iraq War and its aftermath, especially the aftermath, where most people who were killed in Iraq were not killed as a result of American or British military activity. They were killed by other Iraqis because the management of Iraq after the Americans had conquered it was so appallingly incompetent when Paul Bremer, the American-imposed sort of Governor General of Iraq, he disbanded the Iraqi army, so he sent the soldiers home with their weapons. We don't need you anymore, go home. They take their weapons with them. And he abolished the Ba'ath Party, so suddenly the civil service no longer existed. Iraq no longer had a functioning government. And there was a massive amount of internal sectarian violence between Iraqi Sunnis, Iraqi Shias, which is where most of the deaths happened, but ultimately the blame for that rests with the Americans because they were in charge.
Tell me some of your personal stories, maybe personal life journey in politics especially, as you're Muslim yourself.
Yeah.
How have you been treated in the Westminster Parliament? And I'm sure I have personally felt it's a very accepting place, but what has your experience been like?
Well, my practical experience of politics, I mean, I've been a politics junkie again since the age of 10, and I've been a member of political parties starting with my university days. So when I was
about 18 years old. Yes,
I mean, the first political party I joined was after I'd done my first degree. After doing my degree in mathematics from Cambridge, where I graduated in 1972, I then spent 1 year at Leeds University doing a postgraduate certificate in education. And that was where I was at my furthest left politically. I was an out-and-out Trotskyist, and the first political party I joined was a party called the Socialist Labour League, which later changed its name to the Workers' Revolutionary Party, and it was a Trotskyist party. I then started work. I lost touch with the party. I was not a member of any political party for several years, although I was voting Labour. And then in about 1976, I joined the Liberal Party, which later became the Liberal Democrats. And I was a Liberal for about 5 or 6 years, that in 1983, as a result of watching a television series called Free to Choose on BBC, made by Milton Friedman, and reading Milton Friedman's book, Free to Choose, and also watching Margaret Thatcher, who was then our Prime Minister, and the way she was changing the country, I became convinced of the virtues of free market capitalism. I resigned from the Liberal Party and joined the Conservative Party. And I attended the party conference for the first time in 1984, in Brighton, the year the IRA bombed it. But because I was busy with my professional career with young children, I wasn't actively involved very much. I started attending political events seriously around about 2006 or 7, when I met Lord Sheikh, who was the founder of the Conservative Muslim Forum, which was a part of the Conservative Party. And after that, starting attending party conferences. I've always found the political parties, including the Conservative Party, very welcoming. And it helps if, even though I'm brown, I've lived in this country since I was 2 years old. I speak perfect English. I'm a graduate of Cambridge University. So it's very hard for people to look down on me.
So it's very interesting. I actually didn't know that fact about you, that you initially joined the very left-wing party.
Yeah.
And it must be quite telling about you that you're quite open-minded, because you were able to shift from the left-wing party to the Conservatives, and then later on to the Liberal Democrats. How has that happened?
I am never afraid to change my mind. I'm never afraid to accept that I was wrong. A little part of that comes from the fact that I'm a chess player. So with chess, you get evidence that you cannot disagree with, that your strategy was a failure. And you can't kid yourself that my strategy was right all along when the evidence is there.
Analysis.
That's right. And even in the days before computers, just your own analysis and what the development of the game. And similarly, if you have a background in science, you have to accept the concept that scientific theories are all disprovable if there is new evidence. So it makes you less rooted in an ideology where you say, I'm going to stick to this ideology come what may. And for that reason, my political views have changed over time, my religious views have changed over time. And while I have these political views and the religious views that I have today, I fully accept that they might change in future, although I have no reason to believe that they will.
So you leave a little bit of room for still changes. Not many people do, I'm sure. No. Many people just stick to a certain party and think that their views are going to last. But I myself am also very aware of the fact that your views can change, your perception of reality can change. Even by the war in Ukraine, my views have very much changed. And I'm interested, though, once again, something you have told me in private about the Conservative Party and why you have left it, is what I find really interesting during Boris Johnson times. Yeah, well,
there's nothing secret about this, although I told you in a conversation that was a one-on-one conversation, but it arises from things that I've said on BBC Radio 4 when I was being interviewed on the Today programme. The resignation letter that I sent to the party chairman is published in full on my website. I'm a political realist. You will never have any political party where you agree with that party 100% unless it's a party that you create and that you are the only member. As soon as you have a political party with more than yourself as a member, even if you're the leader, you will find that some of the policies of that party are policies you don't agree with. So I've always been a realist about that. And in the Conservative Party, I am very pro-European Union. For many decades, the leaders of our party, people like William Hague, Ian Duncan Smith, were very anti-European. David Cameron was more sympathetic, but still relatively anti-European in many ways. That has never bothered me. I have no difficulty having a leadership that disagrees with my views, as long as I broadly support overall what Conservative policies stand for. So do I agree with this party more than I disagree with it? That's the only requirement. And even more so, do I agree with this party more than I agree with any other party? However, every single leader I have ever known of the Conservative Party, and for that matter, every single leader I've ever known of the Labour Party or the Liberal Democrats, even though you can't be a member of all the parties at the same time, I have felt was a person who was genuinely trying to do their best for the country and was a person of individual integrity. Boris Johnson failed both of those tests, in my view. My view, which I've shared openly, is that I believe that Mr. Johnson does not care about the difference between truth and falsehood. As an example, in early 2019, he stood on a platform at JCB, the construction manufacturing firm, and claimed that he never said that Turkey was joining the European Union. And of course, almost immediately, people found lots of clips to show that he was. And the other disqualification in my eyes for Mr. Johnson, apart from his not caring about the truth, is that I don't think he cares about anybody but even himself. And the example I cited in my resignation letter to the party chairman about that was the famous or infamous article he wrote in the Telegraph newspaper in 2018 about Muslim women who wear niqab and burqa. And if you read the article very carefully, he actually says he doesn't want to ban it, and he's criticizing bans in European countries, but the whole style of the article, the language he uses, is clearly intended, in my view, and Mr. Johnson is an expert user of the English language, so it wasn't an accident. He knew exactly what effect on the reader he was going to create, was done to increase his credentials with the right wing of the Conservative Party, because he could see a leadership election coming when eventually Theresa May had to step aside, and he wanted to position himself as well as possible, and he did not care that that kind of article would lead to Muslim women in the streets being attacked as they were. He did that. In my view, he is so selfish that he wrote that article to advance his own career, uncaring about the effect on Muslim women.
Now, as you mentioned, you have immigrated to the UK at the age of 2.
Yes.
But many of the people arriving now, legally and illegally, are arriving at all kinds of ages,
yes.
Including myself. But many people have especially a problem with a lot of people arriving from Muslim majority countries, as in their point of view, they're bringing their culture, and people from there tend to be quite confident, so some of them would go ahead and try to convince people of changing their points of views or be assertive. Or some people would argue, some of the politicians I've spoken with would argue that these people, for example, view women as second world citizens. Do you think these people, by their immigration here, they contribute to a certain change in the country or undermine British values?
Well, it's, again, like most things in life, it's complicated. And the backgrounds that they come from, you have to look at their culture that they're coming from and think not about the totality of the culture, but of individual parts of their culture separately, because culture consists of many different things. So at its most trivial level, it's a part of your culture what kind of food you like eating. Mm. So if you like eating strong curries, there's nothing wrong with having a desire to eat strong curries in this country, or even try to persuade other people of the value of eating strong curries.
Okay.
If you're a Muslim, you're entitled to try to persuade other people to become Muslims, because if you think it's the best religion, then why should you not try to encourage other people to become Muslims? In the same way that a Christian is entitled to try to encourage other people to become Christians. Christians are fully free to try to convert me to Christianity if they want to. amount of time I'm willing to spend in talking to them, varies depending on how busy I am, but there's nothing inherently wrong with that. If they have the attitude that women are fundamentally inferior people, and there are some cultures overseas where that is quite clearly the case, the first thing to remember is that that is not in itself an Islamic belief. I remember talking to the Malaysian Minister for Women in Malaysia when she was about to be interviewed, and when I was in Malaysia in 2010 for the World Islamic Economic Forum, and I said to her, the problem for Malaysian women is not Islam. The problem for Malaysian women is Malaysian men. And she agreed with me. Because that kind of misogyny arises from the behavior of people. If you study Islam and the Koran and what it says, it is not a religion that treats women as second-class citizens. Men and women are equal in the eyes of God, quite clearly. There are things that get abused. So, for example, the Koran has rules about making business contracts and having business contracts witnessed, and it says get a witness for each party, a man, but if you can't get a man, then get two women. And that's used by some people to, especially people who are anti-Muslim bigots, but it's even used by some Muslims to argue that somehow a woman only counts as half of a man because they're less intelligent or whatever. The reality is that in the culture of 600 AD Arabia, men did business and women generally did not do business. So they were less experienced at witnessing contracts, understanding what should be in a contract, so it's more reliable to get two women rather than one. But that's the full extent of the issue. Similarly, there are inheritance rules in the Quran that give women in the Quran smaller inheritance ratios than daughters rather than sons. But that's in a culture where there was an obligation on husbands to maintain their wives, but there was no corresponding obligation on wives to maintain their husbands. You have to look at the culture of the society that those rules came from in its fullness, rather than just assuming that Islam has this particular view. But unfortunately, many of the men who come from countries like Afghanistan, which are very patriarchal societies, they don't have a deep, nuanced understanding of Islam any more than most British people living in this country have a deep, nuanced understanding of Christianity or the history of Christianity or Christian theology.
Okay, so that's a very interesting take from Quran. And obviously, I haven't read Quran myself. I can't correct or agree with you on that point. But I am a Christian Orthodox. I consider myself religious. And I have investigated what the Bible means. I have read the Bible. I have tried to analyze the Bible. It's a very hard book. And I'm sure you have more expertise on Quran than I do.
I've also read the Bible from the very first verse of Genesis to the last verse of Revelation.
So I'm very interested because many people justify their hatred for Muslim population coming from other countries by the fact that Quran is not a peaceful book and Islam is not a peaceful religion. Would you agree with that statement?
No. For a start, if you want to look at the history, or if you want to look at the texts, look at the appalling genocides that are in the first 5 books of the Old Testament and the way that the Canaanites were treated by the Israelites when they invaded the Promised Land. So the reality is, if you're going to understand these religions, you have to understand them in detail. There's a review on my website of a very short book. It's only 20 pages long. The Quranic theories of the war, or Quran, I can't remember the exact title. It was written by a man called Joel Hayward, who is a New Zealander who is a convert to Islam, and he was a lecturer at the RAF Staff College. And he explains in this book how similar Islamic teaching about war is to the Christian concept of a just war. I don't know how familiar you are with Christian, this is particularly Roman Catholic rather than Orthodox. I haven't studied Orthodox Christianity in any detail, but the Christian concept of a just war, and I don't know how much of this dates to before the schism between Orthodox Christianity and Roman Catholic Christianity, which I think took place around about 11 or 1200 AD. But the concepts, he says, are very, very similar. So it's entirely wrong to simply say the Koran is a more militaristic book or a more warlike book than the Bible. But that, to my mind, illustrates ignorance of both the Koran and of the Bible.
One of the final points I would like to ask you, I would like to raise on this podcast is, how would you describe yourself politically as of right now?
Politically, as of right now, I'm a fully paid-up member of the Liberal Democrats and quite active in the Liberal Democrats. I'm a strong believer in free market capitalism, so on the left-right spectrum, I would describe myself as probably centre-right, but if you describe me as centre-left, I wouldn't feel insulted. I'm certainly not extreme left, and I'm certainly not extreme right. I'm socially liberal in terms of the way that I think laws should be made to permit other people to do things, while being incredibly socially conservative in my own behaviour. So I believe, for example, that premarital sex is religiously wrong. I believe adultery is wrong. I don't drink alcohol. But if other people want to drink alcohol, if other people want to commit adultery, or if other people want to have sex outside before they get married, that's up to them.
And finally, you're very careful about throughout the whole podcast. I can see how, and when we talked in person, I can see how you're very careful about things that you're trying to say and the message you're trying to convey to the audience or to the person you're talking with. How important do you think are hate speech laws in our society? And do you think they do good a job as in limiting and trying to mitigate the harm that can be caused by one in talking to other people?
I support the general concept of hate speech laws, and I think British society, or the British legal system, generally manages to draw the boundaries in the correct places. So, for example, I've looked very closely at the law on the incitement to racial hatred and the incitement to religious hatred, and there's a big difference between those two laws, the incitement to racial hatred and the incitement to religious hatred, because the incitement to religious hatred, no prosecution can take place without the express approval of the Attorney General. And the reason is because British law, quite rightly, want to protect the right of all people to criticise all religious beliefs without exception. But if you're going to say we should round up the Jews and put them in concentration camps and in gas chambers, I believe that should be punished because it's not enough to say, I only talked about Jews together. I wasn't talking about Baruch Goldstein over there. So because I'm not trying to kill Baruch Goldstein, I'm just saying that Jews generally should be rounded up and expelled from this country. But the threshold that you have to exceed under English law before you have spoken criminally is actually very, very high. And when J.D. Vance criticises European countries for their hate speech laws, he doesn't understand our laws at all. The thresholds for prosecution are actually very high.
Fair enough. Well, thank you for your time. And I think it has been an amazing discussion.
Certainly, glad to help.